Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. Today, guys, welcome back to another conspiracy theories with Ike video. I'm going to go ahead and give a quick heads up to people who are watching this video. This video does deal with religion and some concepts such as death, suicide, things like that. So trigger warning first and foremost. If you are not really sure about conversations regarding religion, or maybe you are very religious, this may not be a video for you, basically. So I don't want anybody to get upset. So trigger warning in advance. We're going to be talking about some stuff today, so let's get right into it. But actually, before we get into it, I do want to give a special thanks to the Redditors over on the R icebergs, I think is what it is. Basically, if you've never heard of icebergs, I've talked about it last time. The iceberg concept is that you have something and it is in a descending order based on some criteria, whether it be most disturbing or really deep or unknown or popularity, stuff like that. And this video is no different. We are talking about a conspiracy theory iceberg. Specifically, we're talking about a concept from the bottom of that iceberg. And so I wanted to thank the people over at Reddit. I'll actually, later on, I'll actually talk about these specific Redditors who put information onto the site that I used as part of my research to kind of figure out, what we were talking about today. So thank you to them. Not that they'll ever watch this probably, but, if they ever happen to, I am deeply appreciative of you taking the time to explain this to myself and other people on the Reddit. And that's a wonderful way for information to be used, gathered, and spread across the internet. And I love it. One of the good things about Reddit and social media in general. So today, guys, we're going to be getting into a concept, a conspiracy theory, a religious theory called God's last wish. So God's last wish. Now, God's last wish is sort of a very loaded phrase. God's last wish kind of refers to, obviously, a God, whomever that might be, basically having a last wish for us. So before we kind of get into the theory itself, when you look at the iceberg, and I'll put it up here, it's a pretty big iceberg. I actually was looking through this and I was like, I need to find one of these that I want to talk about. And I went to the very bottom just because, why wouldn't you? And I saw a couple of these, and one of them was God's last wish. Why did I go down to this tier? I have no idea. Maybe it was fate. But I went down to that tier, saw God's last wish, went to the comments, started reading, and it really sparked some interest inside me that I was like, wow, this is really weird and strange. And then it sort of sent me down a rabbit hole. Now, the bad thing about this theory is that there's not a whole lot of information about it outside of Reddit. There is some information because there was a philosopher who we'll talk in a little bit who did sort of pioneer, in a way, I guess, some of these informations. And there is also another, a whole sect of religion that sort of believes something similar to this, but not quite. That being said, we're actually going to talk about the actual theory now. So basically, God's last wish, the premise and most basic principle of this is that you and I are God's last wish. So the surface level of this, and when I say we are God's last wish, that sort of sparks something, kind of makes you question, what exactly does that mean? So on a surface level, this is kind of what that means. God was somehow dying or going to die and used all of his power to create us in the hopes that we eventually become gods ourselves. Now, this is obviously a very interesting story. There are actually a lot of different video games and animes who kind of have a similar premise that, God created a certain species. I think Destiny was one of the ones somebody mentioned because the Guardians were created as like a spark of, God, like a deity's last wish to kind of help guide and protect humans or people in general. I really haven't played Destiny in a while, so forgive me. But basically this concept revolves around the belief that God is dead. He used his energy to create us in hopes that we will one day transcend to then take over his post, essentially. And it's a very interesting theory. Obviously, there are a lot of things that kind of go into whether or not this could be real or not. Definitely, but depends on your ability, or I should say your belief system, because some folks don't believe in God, some people do. It may even be heresy to even be talking about this to some folks because that's just not how their religion functions. Now, people have also mentioned that, I believe it's Mormonism, has the concept that eventually through Mormonism you can reach a level like of enlightenment or transcendence where you do become sort of a deity in your end of yourself. So this obviously has certain applications in other religions, but specifically the concept of God's last wish is that he was dying somehow, some way, and then with his last bit of energy basically created humans. Now, obviously, there are some implications of this theory, God's last wish, being that he creates with his energy these people who he wants to eventually become God. Now, there are some implications of this, one of which being the Bible. Now, the Bible obviously doesn't support or I guess deny this per se, but what it does do is it does provide us some conflicting accounts. There are some instances in the Bible where people talk to God. For instance, Moses talks to God through the burning bush. And there are some other ones too that I can't think of off the top of my head because I'm not super religious or anything. But there are some Bible stories that do sort of conflict with this. So it's like, did they actually talk to God? Or was this just a fabrication? Is the Bible real? And then I guess the other side of that is if the Bible was real, who were they talking to? Because if God is dead, in theory, there wouldn't be a way for you to talk to him because he no longer exists on our plane of existence, right? There's no way for him to talk to you if he is no longer existing. Now, obviously, there is also the implication that if God is not real, or God is, I guess in this case, we're assuming that there was a God, but he is not dead. Is there an afterlife, right? And when we go to this afterlife, is there going to be God there? And is God going to just be like a bystander, essentially? And not only that, when do we die? What happens? Is there like another step? Or is there something else that could happen? Or if there is no afterlife, what happens to your soul? Is there souls, right? And there's also the concept of, is death transcendence, right? And this is something we'll talk about here in a second, but there's the concept of if death is transcendence. Is death the final step to enlightenment? So really, it's just a question of what happens next. Now, really, there's not really a whole lot of information that talks about what happens next. With God's last wish and that whole concept and the whole theory, there's really not much that talks about the next step, right? That's not something that you or I, that I can at least find, has information about. Really, all God's last wish is that we were breathed into life with his final breaths. And that with that, it was in hopes that one day we would transcend and become a godlike figure. So obviously that's kind of where that theory ends in a way. I didn't really find any other information. There's like a band that has like a song called God's Last Wish. I tried to find some other information, and there's really only one other, I guess, train of thought with God's Last Wish that I'm going to talk about next. But certainly this is a very interesting theory. There's a lot of definitely heavy implications with this theory. And so I guess there's really just a lot to talk about, but not a whole lot more information to give any answers to any of the questions that you or I may have. So this next part talks about a actual philosophical belief, and I'm going to say that this information that I'm about to share with you is secondhand information. I do not have the ability to read the first-hand illustration of this information because it's in German. I don't speak German. That being said, Philip, mainlander, and he has a text called Philosophy of Redemption. So sort of just the information here, information dump. So information dump, get ready. Basically talks about God's last wish and the concept of God's ego death. Now, God's ego death in of itself is a whole nother video I can make, so I'm not going to go into that a whole lot. Just know that God's ego death is a concept of this. Basically, it's the concept of God deciding or knowing that non-existence / death is inherently better than existence and life. And God decided to kill himself, okay? God's ego death, right? But the reason he can't kill himself is because he is the only obstacle in which can do so, right? His only obstacle to reaching redemption, or non-existence in this case, was himself. So what he did was he split the pieces of himself. You and I are those pieces, and we exist solely to die and grant God's last wish. That's a loaded statement, all right? Like I said, it's in German. Not something that I really have a whole lot of information on. And I guess there is some other aspects to this that I don't speak German. There was some English translations, but it's essentially all I could get out of it. And then I read obviously some folks on Reddit's information. But here's sort of the kind of my juxtaposition in regards to that. Because first of all, this whole theory is fucking mind-blowing. All right, when you're talking about things like God's ego death and God's last wish, so basically it's like this whole concept of God is trying to kill himself, but he can't. And in the process of trying to kill himself, he puts a piece of himself in all of creation, right? And then as creation begins to die, right, his essence also dies. So then his last wish of death, in this case, would be that he dies. God's last wish and God's ego death both coincide because his last wish is his death. But he cannot die, right? God's ego death cannot exist. It's like a functional issue. There is more to go into with God's ego death that I don't have the information on right now. So that might be another follow-up that I do. But there's something in that theory that says that God cannot die. For whatever reason, he can't die. So the only way to do so is through his last wish. He puts a piece of himself in all of creation, you and I and everything else, and he uses that as a way for him to die, right? By putting a piece of himself in a mortal shell, that mortal shell will die by accomplishing death and non-existence. It is God's last wish. Now, this is obviously some heavy implications, because if God's last wish is for him to die, and the way to successfully accomplish that wish is for you and I to die, then I guess that sort of goes into sort of a really deep, dark, nihilistic kind of aspect, where really the only purpose you and I serve is to eventually die to appease this deity, right? And his appeasement is because he himself cannot kill himself or cannot die. So the only way he can die is by slowly but surely eroding away at himself by allowing people to die in his place. So it's sort of definitely a loaded conversation when we look at it from this perspective, because you have the original perspective, which is just that he wanted us to become deities, right? Philip Mainlander had the idea that, well, that wasn't really what he wanted. He wanted to die, and the only way for him to die was to put a part of himself inside these mortal coils to then die, and by those mortal coils dying, then accomplishes and appeases what he originally wanted, which was for himself to die to achieve that final redemption, that final evolution, that final transcendence, or whatever it might be. So it's sort of honestly, it's really disturbing, right? If this were to be true, just theoretically, then pretty much every religion out there is working on an unknown notion that A, they're going to get into heaven, or B, that there is an afterlife, when in reality, if this thought process is true, either A, you and I only exist to try and attain the status of a deity, or you and I only exist to die to appease a creator's will and want to die, right? So it's sort of a weird paradox where we live to die because that is what our God wants, right? Honestly, and there's more to it than this. This is just like a very scratching the surface type deal. There's more to it. There's more in this philosophy of redemption book that I can't read. There's more to the concept overall. There are more people who do have more thought processes on this, but this is just basically the surface, right? And as I showed this, chart, this theory is on the bottom level. And a lot of people, I guess, don't understand that maybe it's not a super complex theory, but it's a very unfortunate and a very dark theory, because it has a lot of implications that not only affect you and I, but it affects the very existence of life. That being said, we're going to take a real huge step back because this is a very deep and dark concept to really think about. So I'm going to have some final thoughts up next, and then I'll have some thanks that I want to give to some folks on Reddit. As always, I just want to give a little, I guess, closing off note that this is all just speculation. This is all my understanding and my interpretation of this information. I could have completely misrepresented something and not have meant to do so. So if anybody out there is more of an expert on any of these concepts than I am, feel free to correct me. I'm not going to be upset. In fact, I want to learn more about this kind of stuff, but it's really one of those situations where I have very limited access to some of this information, so I sort of have to go off of secondhand knowledge. And so if anybody has additional information that I don't have, please tell me. Something I'm always looking for is an opportunity to continue to learn and continue to have those experiences. So that being said, I want to give some thanks to people on Reddit. I do apologize. I wasn't able to get this information and ask them for permission, but given that is a public forum, I'm going to assume that it is okay for me to use that information because they put it on a public forum. If they have any issue with that, feel free to reach out to us. But I do want to give a thanks to Cicada1205 for the iceberg, and they also did a really good job of explaining God's last wish as the first definition. And then I also want to give a thanks to Take Down His Shield for the information regarding Philip Mainlander. Both of them really made this video possible because in reality, when I tried to do just my own research, I wasn't getting a whole lot of information. Like I said, there's like a band that has a song about God's last wish and everything else. And Philip Mainlander it's in German, and I don't really, I don't read or write or speak German. So really, thanks to those people who did give me the opportunity to have this information be, translated and interpreted in the way I was able to do. And of course, if they have any issues with this, let me know. I gave you credit. Hopefully that's good enough. If not, let me know. We'll talk about it on Twitter or Facebook. So if you want to join the Geek-Stew crew, let us know in the comments. We'll get in touch with you, leave your at, we'll reach out to you, or hit us up on Facebook or social media, Twitter, whatever else. But hope everybody out there staying safe, stay happy, stay healthy, stay awesome, and question everything. We'll see you in the next one.